Hi, biology honors students. Welcome to your second lesson dealing with ecology. Today we're going to talk about population ecology and how basically groups of organisms live and grow. So the maximum number of offspring an organism produces is its biotic potential. So we're really going to focus on what keeps organisms from reaching their biotic potential. And these are really just environmental limits. So how much resources the environment can actually give to the organism and what the environment pertains to, like disease. And this is called environmental resistance. So we're going to look at population growth, and just a reminder, a population is the same species living together. So we're talking about a population of deer, for example, a group of deer living in the same environment. And looking at just the deer, we're not looking at the deer and the rabbit and the amount of sunlight. When we're looking at population, we're focusing on the deer population. So there's two types of growth that populations can go through. And there's the exponential model or exponential growth, and this is ideally what populations want to be doing. They want to be exponentially growing. It's called the R populations, and you can see that it makes a J-shaped curve. If you look at the graph over here, you can see this is more of a J-shaped curve here. Then we have what we call logistic growth, or the logistic model. This is what normally happens in a population, and we call these K populations, and we're going to talk about the difference between these K and R populations in a little bit. And it's going to be more of an S-shaped curve. So pause for a second. Look at these two growth models. Which one do you think happens most often? So what you should have said is logistic growth. Logistic growth occurs more than exponential growth. And the reason that populations can't exponentially grow forever is because they run into that environmental resistance. They're not going to have enough food for everybody if they keep exponentially growing. Bigger populations, if you just keep exponentially growing, is going to also lead to things like more disease. So what happens is we see populations reach a certain number. Okay, for this population, this hypothetical population, it's 1,500, and that's when we get the S-shaped curve of this logistic growth. And we call this number here the carrying capacity of that population. This is how many organisms of that population the environment can actually sustain. All right, so now we're going to talk about adaptations to increase biotic potential. This is the difference really between our R-selected species and our K-selected species. So R-select species are going to have a short lifespan and short maturation, and Ks are going to be opposite. They're going to have a long lifespan and long maturation. And what I mean by maturation is it's going to take them a little bit longer to be able to reproduce and make their own offspring. With R-selected, we tend to see many offspring occur. So this is going to be like insects, for example. Insects don't just have one offspring every time they mate. Sometimes they have thousands of offspring and lay thousands of eggs. And then when we look at the K-selective, it says large offspring, but there are few. This would be an example of a human. When we reproduce, we have between 1 and 3 children at a time. The normal number is 1, and sometimes we have twins or multiples, and they tend to be larger. We also see that with the R-selected species, there's little to no parental care. So if you think about a frog, for example, frogs are going to lay thousands of eggs in a pond and kind of just take off. They're not going to watch their offspring grow up. And then when we look at K-selective species, Elephants, for example, when an elephant has an offspring, it stays with them for a very long time. It could even be their entire life. When we look at humans have extensive parental care. Even when you look at chimpanzees, they're often taking care of their young for a very long time. Okay, so R-selected, opportunistic, high death rate, K-selected, equilibrial, and a low death rate. What do I mean by this? R-selective species are going to have a lot of children or offspring, but a lot of them aren't going to make it to adulthood. A lot of them are going to die very young. And then when we look at K-selective species, their populations kind of stay the same, and usually their offspring make it to adulthood. So they have a low death rate when the offspring are young. So I've given you quite a few examples of each of these types of species. What I want you to do is pause the video and try to give at least 2 examples I didn't mention and see if you can come up with any. All right, so hopefully you came up with a few. We're going to move on. So now we're going to look at survivorship curves, and these are looking at type 1, type 2, and type 3 species. So type 1 is going to have a longer lifespan and death at an old age. So you can see here when the offspring are born, there's not a lot of deaths and they usually live until adulthood. Then we have type 2, which is kind of just equal. You're going to have the same death rate for young and old. And then type 3 death is going to occur at a young age. So there's going to be offspring, and most are going to die before they reach adulthood. So thinking about our R and K selective species from the previous slide, I want you to pause the video, and I want you to think about a species that probably fits type 1, one that fits type 2, and one that fits type 3. So when we look at these curves, I'll tell you right now, type 1, these are going to be your K-selective species. So this is going to be humans, elephants, polar bears, really large mammals. Type 2, a good example would probably be birds or smaller mammals like squirrels. And then type 3, those are going to be our R-selective species. So these are going to be species that produce a lot of offspring at one time, but a lot of them do not make it to adulthood. So maybe species of fish, frogs, even maybe like mussels living in the ocean, insects, mosquitoes, for example. These are all going to be your type 3 survivorship curves. So now let's talk a bit more about our carrying capacity and density-dependent factors. So we've mentioned earlier that populations are going to start to exponentially grow when they get into a new environment. Then what's happening is they're going to overshoot their carrying capacity. They're actually going to have more organisms than the environment can support. But what happens is it starts to level out. And you can see here that the carrying capacity is about 1.5 million organisms for this population. And a lot of times carrying capacity, or how much the environment can support, is going to depend on what we call a density-dependent factor. This is going to be your necessary resources like food, water, and shelter. Predation and disease is also really important when looking at density-dependent factors. The more population grows, that means the more predators population is going to grow. The larger a population is, the more susceptible to disease that population is going to be. So these are all density-dependent factors that are going to limit a population and have it reach its carrying capacity and not keep exponentially growing. Density-independent factors are going to be things like weather and climate. So for example, if let's say it's a very, very warm summer, an abnormally warm summer, and we're in the forest, and this type of beetle lays a bunch of eggs, and since the weather is so hot, a lot of the eggs don't hatch. That's a density independent factor. That's not really going to affect the population maybe overall, but it's definitely going to affect it for that year. So these factors are going to lead to that carrying capacity. And this is the number of individuals that can be sustained in an environment. And this number is very important to population ecologists when even looking at giving out hunting tags. They need to know the populations of deer and other hunted species to know, okay, this is about how many can be hunted without the population going too low and staying at that nice carrying capacity. So remember that biotic potential and environmental resistance, we all have to deal with this. Even the human population right now is dealing with a lot of environmental resistance. We always talk about superbugs could come right now and disease could really wipe out a huge number of our population. Food and water is a really big density dependent factor for the human population. It's really hard to maintain crops that are appropriate for how fast and exponentially the human population is growing. Luckily, sometimes this can lead to adaptation, meaning that organisms can actually adapt to new environments and move to new environments if we have these density dependent factors occurring. So now we're going to talk about symbiosis and symbiotic relationships. These are when two unrelated organisms live close together and have some sort of relationship with each other. And you can see here that after we talk about one symbiotic relationship, we're going to have this. Mutualism, for example, means that both species are benefiting. So we have two plus signs. Mutualism would be, for example, birds sitting on a big mammal in the African savanna, and the birds are eating all the bugs off of this large mammal. The mammal is benefiting because it's getting rid of probably parasitic bugs, and the bird is benefiting because it has a really nice meal. Next is commensalism. It's a plus minus. So one benefit is one species is benefiting, but the other one is unaffected. This, for example, could be barnacles maybe on a whale, kind of just hitching a ride all over the ocean. The barnacle is obviously being taken places and getting food, but the whale really doesn't care that the barnacle is attached to it. Then we have parasitism. Okay, we've all heard of parasites. One species is benefiting, but the other is harm. That would be ticks. Ticks are a great example of this, feeding on other animals, taking away their nutrients from them. And then we have neutralism. This can be neither organism benefits or is hurt. So this is where we're going to go ahead and stop video 1. We're going to continue on video 2, so please pause and please continue watching this lecture on video 2.